Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex. Welcome to our Dalim Worldwide Technical Meeting Recap. For those of you who may not be as familiar with the meeting, it's basically Dalim's annual technical conference. It's held once a year, usually in December, near Kiel, Germany, where Dalim's headquarters are located. And is generally a meeting that's designed to discuss, one, some of the new features that may have recently been released in Dalim products, as well as two, kind of the roadmap for what's going to be coming out over the next few years. So for those of you who are new to our webinar series, if my screen does show up a little too scaled or a little too large, there is a zoom button in the upper left-hand corner of the main GoToWebinar window. You can hit that button to either expand to cover the full screen or scale down maybe if you need to see more of my screen. There is in the GoToWebinar control panel, a questions area where you can type any questions you might have. What this will act as basically we'll have a Q&A at the end. If I see any questions that are particularly pertinent to something I'm discussing, I may pause the presentation to address it at that time. Otherwise, I will address these questions at the end after the presentation. This is part of what is typically our tips and tricks webinar series. We do a Dalim tips and tricks webinar the third Wednesday of each month. And there's typically a full list of our events at blanchardsystems.com/events. Usually we figure out what we're going to be doing for a webinar about roughly a month in advance, and we push the information up there when we have it available so that you can register for these presentations. So really what we're going to be discussing today falls into three categories. The first is just general enhancements. A lot of these were snuck in towards the end of the last generation of Dalim applications, or in the most recent releases of Twist 8 and ES5 and Dialog Engine 5.1. These might not rise to the occasion of being a new feature, but these are the sort of enhancements that aren't as well advertised, but really do go a long way towards improving the usability and the efficiency of these applications. So to get started here, one of my favorites that came out during the meeting is there is now an option in ES5 to either bypass or delete an approver directly from that right-hand approver status pane. There's an option here. It is controlled by a user profile option, so you can turn this off if you don't want every user to have this ability. But you can just right-click, and if there's someone who, for example, maybe there's an approver you're waiting on, they went out to lunch, they haven't come back in time, and you've got a hot deadline, you can right-click on that approver's name in that window and click to bypass or to delete that approver from the file. The delete works the same way it would if you'd actually opened up the properties window and manually removed them, just fewer clicks. The bypass actually does kind of gray out the icon. It designates that they've been bypassed for this approval, and it lets the file, it considers it basically as if they had approved. So if you have multiple approvers, the other approvers would still need to approve unless they too were bypassed. But that's one way to, I know we have a lot of customers in prior versions of ES have had to resort to kind of generic gatekeeper users to address situations like that. This is one way that burden can be reduced. There are also some new enhancements to the user action functionality within ES, namely the inclusion of some pre-built functions. In previous versions of ES, you were limited to basically using a user action as a wrapper around a document workflow or project workflow or something of that nature. In ES5, you have the ability to choose also from a list of built-in actions, for example, to export a CSV, restart workflow processing. In this way, it acts as a nice wrapper where you can give, maybe you want a user to have the ability to reprocess a file, but you don't want to give them the ability to see all of the workflow infrastructure under the hood. This is one way you could basically accommodate that sort of need. There is also another one of my personal favorites here is there is now a download automatically option for some of the user action targets. The way this works is in prior versions of ES. So if you're in ES 4.5 and you had an action that did some transformation, maybe it added a watermark to a file or you created a contact sheet or did some other adjustment, you really had three main options for output. You could either save it back to the active working file in ES. You could deliver it either to an email or a file system location with the digital delivery tool, or you could place it into the basket where the user would have to manually go and download the file. In ES5, if you choose the basket as your target, there is now a download automatically option in here, which allows you to basically, when you run the action, you click the action, it performs whatever action it's going to on the file. And as soon as the file is done processing, it opens up a download prompt in your browser. So this would be useful in a circumstance where you don't want to necessarily save that change back to the working file. Maybe you're making a contact sheet, for example. You select all the files you want in ES from the user's perspective. They hit the Make Contact Sheet button, and when it's ready, the new file pops up for download. So that is incredibly useful, I've found in my brief testing. There are also some new enhancements to the rule set functionality. It's now possible to assign custom metadata properties in rule sets based off of information in the file name or upload location. This metadata can be configured under the System Administration menu. There's a new tab in there, and under there that gives you an option where you can basically link metadata properties that can be configured or used in a rule set. Then in the rule set, you would just go to the properties area, click to add a new property, and your variable will be here. You could pull anything you wanted out of the file name or upload path and use that to set that variable directly without having to rely as heavily on programmed Java links. Now, there's a new class of users in ES5 that are called web users, and these are basically limited user accounts that allow someone to perform a few basic functions without consuming a concurrent user license. The way these work are, these are defined when you create the user. You click the check to enable them as a web user. Then what happens is, as a web user, they are very limited regardless of what the user profile gives them permission to do. They can only view files, upload files, and download files, and only from file systems. So they can't do anything with projects. They can't approve files, reject them, annotate them. It's really just a way to use ES as a front end for a file system or network share you may have in your plant. So the way this works from a licensing perspective is there's now a new class in the license called concurrent web users. And the way it works is either you have automatically 5 times the number of concurrent users as concurrent web users. So for example, if you had 5 concurrent users on your ES install, with ES5 you have 25 concurrent web users. That would mean you could have a total of 30 people logged in consecutively or at the same time. So you could have your 5 concurrent users and your 25 concurrent web users in at the same time. There are also, speaking of job tickets and job ticket layouts, there are new job ticket components for a trim editor and a crop editor. And what these allow you to do, the trim editor allows you to define the trim area for a PDF or anything of that nature, and the crop area editor allows you to select an area to crop. These don't actually perform the actual manipulation of the file, but they do record the area that you select into metadata so that you can perform any needed adjustments in Twist or eTwist. ES5 also has support for built-in watermarking. This would be both in thumbnails and in dialog view. By default, it tends to show Dalim standard logo. You can put in any image of your own that you want. It's a custom modification to the basically the Java or the Tomcat environment variables to do that. You just have to add this following line here into Symlinks common Tomcat 7.0 bin env.sh. You put this in here, you put a path to your file. I haven't had too much luck with PNGs. GIFs have been working pretty well for me. You typically want something that has a transparent background so that it tiles nicely over the image. But whatever watermark you place in that configuration will be tiled, and it's shown at, I think, like roughly 50% opacity. These watermarks are applied with either a user profile or a profile mask. So you can have it so that maybe a file shows a watermark until it reaches a certain step in the project, or certain users can only see files with watermarks applied. Twist 8 also was recently released and has some new enhancements. One of the biggest is there's now a native editor client for Windows and Mac OS. You're no longer reliant on that JNLP Java Web Start file, which means that there is no need for some of the Java security hoops I know a few of y'all have had to jump through over the past few years. This will work for both Twist and eTwist. With eTwist, you generally just point into your web server and log in with your ES credentials. So a lot more streamlined of a way of launching that editor and less hoops to jump through in general. There are also some new features in image action. New formats such as BMP are now supported, and there is support for conditional adjustments. For example, a resize only if certain conditions are met. In addition, as far as output's concerned, there's now support for OpenType output and PDF X5N output. Dalim also did spend some time discussing recent security enhancements during the conference. A few of the ones on the back end, the recent releases of ES5 and Twist 8 have upgraded the respective Postgres and Tomcat versions included, and I believe they've been putting more focus on putting those patches in as they're available with incremental, just general software patches. They have the services that are associated with these products are running under less privileged users. For example, I believe the Postgres service in ES5 no longer runs under the root user. It now has its own privileged or its own less privileged Postgres user. So I think the one that still needs root is the license manager, though I believe Christoph did mention they were working on that, unless they were also working towards SC Linux compatibility. From the user perspective, there are also some enhancements in ES. In ES5, there is now a new IP filter option, which allows you to basically configure for certain users they can only log in from a certain IP range or certain IP address, so that you can't have, for example, maybe you don't want your administrator user being logged in from just the bare web and someone guessing their way in. You can have that restricted so someone can only log in as administrator from the local network, for example. There are also, it was introduced late in ES4.5, password security requirements in ES. You can configure the passwords need to have alphanumeric characters or be a certain length or expire after a certain number of days. So you can set a more comprehensive password policy and enforce that directly from within ES. In addition to those general enhancements, there are also some wholesale new features in this most recent release of Twist and ES. One of the biggest in ES too is closed-loop color is now supported in HTML5 dialog. In previous versions, you had to manually upload your user profile just because HTML5 dialog doesn't have the same access to your local file system and computer as the Java version did. This challenge has been solved with the Latitude Helper application, which runs on most recent versions of Mac OS and Windows. And Latitude is basically just a wrapper that handles a lot of different tasks that typically Java would take care of. So, for example, this is used to access your local monitor profile and apply that to any images that are being viewed in dialog. It also supports verification of profiles for closed-loop color, as I mentioned. You can basically set up, it's important to note, it doesn't handle calibration. For calibration, you would just use whatever application you're used to. So I know we have some people who use Color Navigator, or you might use whatever came with your calibration device. In this case, and that's perfectly fine, ES will take whatever system profile you're using and apply it to the image. It does have a built-in verification function that Latitude is supporting. So if you configure closed loop in ES, you can have it configured so maybe every 2 weeks their profile needs to be validated. The dialog, HTML5 dialog, will bring up a validation swatches, and you can check to make sure that their monitor profile is within the required tolerance before letting people view images. One other kind of off-label feature at this point for Latitude 2 is this does support, I don't have it on my slide here, but I can make the information available if any of you need it later. But basically, there is an option to replace the old Java check-in, check-out functionality with new latitude functionality, which doesn't require any Java or any other hoops like that, so that you can check out files in ES. They get downloaded automatically to a folder in your system and then automatically reprocessed in when you check in. There is also now in Dialog a gamut check functionality. And this gamut check allows you to find any areas in your image where either the simulation profile or your monitor profile might have some out of gamut areas in there. So really what it does is there's two sides of this coin. The first is there's an option to highlight any out of gamut areas. There's a button that will show up in the dialog interface that you can click. And any areas in there where information in that source image can't be displayed either in that simulation profile you're using to simulate your press conditions or your monitor profile, where either of those can't display it, it'll flash on the screen where those areas in the image would be. There is also a new feature called Gamut Sentinel. And what Gamut Sentinel does, that's enabled in the user profile, but if you have that in, or actually not the user profile, my mistake. It's enabled in the viewing conditions, which can be assigned either to a project template or a project. When anything is opened that has that Gamut Sentinel on, and there's something out of gamut in either, again, the simulation or monitor profile, it'll flag a little warning here just to let you know that you might not be seeing all of the colors in this image fully. This feature, ES-JDBC, existed kind of undocumented in ES4, but it's been greatly expanded in ES5. And what ES-JDBC is a database service, a wrapper that allows you easy SQL-style access to data in the ES database. So what it really does is it's not an actual live database. You can't write data back to it, for example, but it's a simple little wrapper that allows you to access a few basic pieces of ES information from any JDBC compliant application. So for example, you can see here on mine, you can see just basically some information about customer, deadline, who approved a file, job information, system logs. You can get some of that basic information and use that, for example, if you wanted to use it with a business integration platform, or if you wanted to use that in, for example, maybe like Crystal Reports or a reporting service. You could even use it in Twist with a set param from DB. If you needed to grab ES information, you wouldn't have to go through the API, for example, or necessarily push all that in through the workflow. So that's one way you can access a lot of that information. This does require an API license because the service runs under the API. Now, as far as the roadmap for a few things that are going to be coming out in the near future, this is, first off, there's going to be a barcode reader that'll be coming to Dialog Engine. And the way this works is there will be a little barcode option up here in the menu. You can take this and basically just drag and select over an area of an image, and it'll look to see if it can detect a barcode in there. If it can, it'll put both the contents and the barcode type into a comment. This supports, I think, most major types of barcodes. So it supports the EAN barcodes, it supports QR codes. I think there was a list of about like 10 or so different types of barcodes that it does support. So that's one way if you're proofing and you want to verify that you have the correct contents in a barcode or a QR code, that is an option that will be at your disposal in the future. There will also be upcoming support for text styles in ES annotations. This will allow you to set text as bold, italic, underline, strike through, anything of that nature, so you can emphasize certain parts of an annotation. It won't support any changes to font or text color. Dalim is also working on more long-term developing a planner or project management portion of ES. This is based around some of the existing scheduling data and deadline data that is collected in ES today. But Dalim has been working on a more comprehensive way of displaying this. So basically how this work is, you have, using some of the information that's in ES, you have events and resources. So the events would be, for example, milestones, which are just a fixed deadline of some point. You need something to be done on a certain date. They're also adding a new group of events called tasks. And what a task is, it has something that has a defined start and end date, or a duration of some sorts. So you can represent either parts of a project that take up a chunk of time or specific milestones that are kind of markers along the way. As part of this, there will also be resources that can be assigned to these tasks and milestones. These resources will be either users or groups of users. From what they were showing at the presentation, it looks like at WWTM, it looks like there should be some way in here of, for example, managing your resources and seeing basically who's free and who's working on what and managing basically workload through ES. As part of this too, there will also be, this is I think a hotly requested feature, the ability to delegate tasks within ES. Under this system, users will be able to assign and enable delegates, for example, if they're out of the office, and those delegates can perform approvals and other actions on their behalf. These delegates can be configured, basically you can define these, turn these on or off at the organization or customer level. And these can be, there can be defaults or users can select their own delegates in there as well. If someone approves as a delegate, for example, it would be noted on a report. Dalim is also working on a notification system overhaul for a future release of ES. The main goal of this has been, one, to simplify the tasks required to send emails, and then also allow you to better monitor those. So kind of three prongs here. The first is simplified DB and algorithm. They simplified the underlying infrastructure required to determine who gets notifications. So there's less overhead to determine who needs to get an email. So that way that's less burden on the system overall. There will also be the ability to send mail from other devices if you have a distributed ES install. So for example, as it stands today, if you have a distributed install, it's the app server has the burden of delivering all those emails, which can be CPU intensive. You can, under the new system, basically have that installed as a device on other servers in your cluster. For example, maybe a render or an eTwist, and that way the app server can delegate some of that action to those other servers so that you don't have one server sending all of those notifications. Then the last part of this would be increased monitoring capabilities at both the system and project level for these notifications so you can track what's going on. So really how this would work is, it's kind of the same view whether you view it in the administrative area or in a specific project. But there's three things in here. You can see outgoing mails, which shows you what's currently set to be delivered. You can see subscriptions, see who's supposed to get what emails based on either overall or in a specific project. So if I wanted to see what emails John Smith's going to get from this project, I can see either what they got or what they're going to get. And you can also see, lastly, history of what emails physically have been sent by the system. So really, it's been engineered to be more efficient about the emails that it sends, and also give you more ways to keep track of what notifications are being sent. ES also will be supporting in an upcoming version multi-site implementations, so that you can distribute your cluster a little more geographically in the case of a distributed system. You still have the traditional centralized app and web server, but different devices and volumes can be distributed to other locations, similar to what I believe some of you might have used with Mistral back in the day. So scenario for how this sort of thing would work is you might have your central office in Minneapolis, and you've got the app server and the web server there, but some of the other storage, maybe you've got a file system storage in New York where they're going to be accessing things locally in that file system there. You could store that locally in New York and configure that as part of that New York site in the main ES system, so all that data can be stored remotely. Those remote sites can basically be managed and assigned to either customers or projects. And I think you can have multiple different sites assigned with one project or with one customer. And one of the bigger unveilings during the presentation too was the announcement of new workflow and layout editors in a future release. This is, I wish I had a better screenshot here to show you, but basically just to go over a few of the things in here. There's all your list of tools here would be up on the top, similar to what you might be familiar with from Twist. Down here, you've got your tools. They no longer have the defined start in point and out points. It's a lot more similar to what you might be used to from Twist. These tools over here on the right-hand pane is where you can set any parameters you might need to. So generally looks a lot more similar to what you might have seen in Twist. And I think this is kind of the roadmap for what Dalim is looking to do as far as user experience and user interface going forward. As part of this, one of the biggest things of this is going to be the ability now to have conditional links similar to a set param from RE and Twist. You no longer have to build those sort of things in just Java. So how this would work is, for example, here you can set whether a link needs all conditions or some, and then you can select pieces of metadata and the conditions they would need to match. So this is just metadata in the ES system, for example. But if I would only follow this link if the camera model was equal to Nikon and it was created before June 12th. There will also be the ability to create groups of, to create and save groups of tools. It would basically be a little chunk like this. You can choose the color. They're little color-coded chunks. You can collapse that, and those 4 tools would just show up as that one tool group would show as one tool. And then you could click again to expand it if you wanted to see all the tools within there. From what Dalim was saying, it sounds like that would be something that would be able to be saved. So you could take those tool groups and save them and use them in multiple workflows, kind of repurposing them. As part of that too, there is also the ability to basically select those, to add notes to those, and so you know either what the group does or what individual tools do. So if you've got a much larger workflow, like a few of our customers I've seen in ES have gotten into very large approval workflows for complex approval cycles, you can kind of cordon off different parts so it's a little more documented and a little easier to read. Lastly, this also will support copy and paste of individual tools. Now, lastly, too, one more thing that was being discussed during the conference was the idea of machine learning within ES. And really what this will come down to is they're talking about integrating what I think Jacques was calling the deep learning engine. It's a machine learning engine that's been trained to recognize the contents of images. And the function of this going forward in ES, the implementation of this would basically be able to detect the contents of images and perform initial first round tagging. So for example, if you have to dump 10,000 images into your system, then what you would have to do is that could automatically look through them and kind of suggest tags for what might be in there. So someone manually doesn't have to go through and do that first round tagging. They could come back later and modify or verify them as needed. But yeah, that's about the gist of WWTM. So we'll go over some questions real quick. Let me see what I got here. I don't know if I can see the contents of all these. Browser restrictions for closed loop. I don't believe there are any browser restrictions for closed loop because the way that Dalim got over that requirement is the Latitude helper application. So as long as that protocol can be launched and Latitude can be accessed, it handles that actual calibration under the hood. So the difference between the question here, what is the difference between the ES JDBC and the SQL part of the API? The difference is there isn't really a difference here. They're the same exact thing because there is a way from the API that you can call SQL commands with this ES JDBC function of the API. It's just a different way of accessing that same data. Do delegates get email notifications based on the user they are associated to? I can't remember definitively if this was discussed during the presentation, but I think it was mentioned that delegates could get email notifications. That's something I can check up on and get back to who asked that question on. Got one question here. Why upgrade from Twist 7.5 to 8? So basically the reasons as far as Twist 7.5 to 8, there aren't as many new features specifically, but there are a lot of under the hood enhancements with new support for different types of output and just general enhancements in processing power as well as security enhancements. I know Dalim's been making changes to make sure that you no longer have to go through all the security hoops to launch Editor. There's also a lot of processing just enhancements under the hood and support for new features.
The other reason to do it, of course, is that you will eventually get to the point where ES75 is no longer updated. So you may as well get on the bandwagon now, so that you're on the currently supported and developed version of the product.
Yep, and that's a good point as well. And the last question was the ability to delete revisions brought up. I do remember that was brought up in a few conversations during WWTM. I don't think there was any current plan for that, but it was something Dalim was discussing, but there was nothing presented for a way to delete revisions at the conference. So that's something I can check in on as well and get back to who asked that question. So I think that's all the questions we got here. Actually, I think we might have gotten one more. Can you explain the concurrent license again for the web users? If I currently have 50 license of concurrent users and they're all using the web, ES5 will give more. Now the way it works basically is if you have 50 concurrent users in ES, you get 50 times 5. So that'd be 250. You'd have 50 concurrent users in that case you already have. You would get 250 concurrent web users in addition. So you could have your 250 concurrent web users and your 50 concurrent users logged in at the same time. The caveat there is just the web users can only do a few very basic actions like viewing files and uploading or downloading. They can't really view projects or approve or anything else, but it's basically whatever number of concurrent users you have in your license, you have a separate class of concurrent web users that's 5 times that. And last, are all the changes in Twist 8 documented for easy review? Yes, there should be release notes with the Twist 8 release. I can get those out to the person who asked that question. So yeah, it's in the ES8 installer ISO. There's usually, I think, in the documentation folder, there's a release notes PDF that lists a lot of the changes that are implemented in Twist 8. So, yep, that's the entire list of questions I see here. So thank you very much for attending. Keep an eye out for our next webinar, the third Wednesday of next month, and have a good one.